Thank you for listening to One Mind Dharma's recorded talks. These are recorded talks from our in-person groups in Petaluma and Santa Rosa, California, and online. To learn more about this podcast, you can visit oneminddharma.com/talks. And to learn more about sitting with us, you can visit sonomainsight.org. So today we're going to talk about forgiveness, which is not traditionally one of the Buddhist heart practices, or Brahma Viharas, heavenly abodes, which are metta, loving kindness, karuna, compassion, mudita, appreciative joy, and upekkha, equanimity. I don't remember who said it, but there was a teacher once we were sitting with that said Jack Kornfield introduced forgiveness practice. That was the first time it was really done in the West as we know it. And I don't know about the accuracy of that or not, but I do know that forgiveness practice is not really held anywhere in the Buddhist suttas, and it's not a traditional practice. And part of the argument for that is because it was kind of inherently, it was a given at the time that you forgive yourself and forgive others in the practice, and maybe didn't have to be stated explicitly as we have to today. So I thought that after meditating, we would talk first about what forgiveness is and what forgiveness is not, and then how to work with it a little bit. So a lot of times we struggle with forgiveness because of a few things. We often do dyads in some of our groups, as you know, where people are kind of asking questions back and forth. For those of you that haven't joined us for it, and we've asked the question, what would it be like to forgive yourself completely? And one of the reasons that this question is interesting is because my kind of, a lot of our gut instincts is like, oh, that would be so nice to just forgive ourselves completely. And then when we actually tune into it, it can feel a little bit unsafe, right? Where if you forgive yourself completely, are you giving permission to behave poorly, or are you enabling maybe an unskillful behavior or behavior that's causing harm to someone else? How will you keep yourself in check, essentially? And that's kind of the role that not forgiveness plays. I like to think of the opposite of forgiveness maybe as resentment, which in Latin means to re-feel, that we re-feel these things over and over again. With ourselves, we can kind of hold this grudge against ourselves and re-feel it and keep the memory close or the pain close. And it can kind of serve as a method of not allowing ourselves to behave that way again. That if we're hard on ourselves, it keeps us in this little box of what's okay behavior-wise. Now, I think that forgiveness doesn't really go against that too much. We can forgive ourselves and still hold a set of morals or behavior or ethics or whatever you want to call it. I have a teacher, Noah Levine, that often says, you can forgive someone. When you forgive someone, you can let them back into your heart without letting them back into your home. And that goes for ourselves and for others. And what he's pointing at here is when we forgive someone, we're simply opening our own heart to them. It doesn't mean we have to allow this behavior again. It doesn't mean that we have to necessarily let the person back into our lives. It doesn't mean that we have to put ourselves in harm's way again or any dangerous situations that feel unsafe to us. Elizabeth and I actually had this experience where someone caused us a fairly large amount of harm when we were first dating, actually, and it was a difficult situation, and a lot of harm was caused, and we caused some harm as well with our behavior, and I want to kind of justify that by saying unintentionally, but regardless, we caused harm. And this person responded by causing some harm intentionally back, it seemed like, in my opinion at the time. However, I of course don't know that. And looking back now, it's that hurt people hurt people. When I cause harm to someone and they respond by causing harm, it may not have been intentional. It may not have been a super malicious act. It just happens sometimes. I see it in my own reactions and responses. And for for a few months, up to maybe a year, I had a pretty serious resentment towards this person, and I would see them around town, and we kind of ran with the same crowd, and it was awkward, and I didn't, I don't think I acknowledged the person really. Maybe I said hello, and that was it. But it was pretty clear there was some harm caused both ways. What ended up happening was I ended up talking about it with a teacher maybe a year later, that I was sitting one day and I just noticed this resentment come up kind of out of nowhere. I hadn't been like thinking about it, especially, you know, a lot during that time or anything. It just kind of came up. And I sat with forgiveness practice with it, by my teacher's recommendation, for quite some time, both forgiveness for this other person, forgiveness for myself for causing that harm, and forgiveness for Elizabeth for causing the harm because she had played a role in it as well. And I really came to a point where I felt like I had forgiven the person. Then maybe, another 6 months down the road, someone invited us somewhere to do something with this person, and I said, no, I really don't want to spend time around this person. They've caused a great deal of harm to myself and someone I deeply care about. I'm not really willing to put myself back in that situation. And the person said to me, you really need to work on forgiveness and letting go, man. And I remember thinking, well, my first reaction was probably something angry and unkind. But I remember thinking, I do forgive this person. That doesn't mean I want to spend time with them. And that really is like the point here, is that we can open our hearts and forgive someone. We can really clear that space in the heart without really needing to be around that person or allow them back into our lives. This person was a close friend prior to the harm that was caused, and I didn't, turn around and become friends with the person again. In one of his books, Thich Nhat Hanh talks about wise effort or energy, and how we only have a certain amount of energy to give throughout the day, in our thoughts and actions and in our hearts. And it relates to forgiveness, because I see forgiveness as we have a heart that has a limited amount of space in this metaphor. And when we don't have forgiveness, some of that space is taken up by like a black, tarry, gross resentment, just sitting at the bottom, taking up space. And what happens is, as we do forgiveness practice and we work on forgiving someone, we can free up that space for more kindness, for more care, for more open-heartedness. I've seen it in my own life with multiple people I've done forgiveness practice toward, including myself, in that as I work with forgiveness, and I can't honestly say there's a point where I have forgiven this person or that person. It's definitely a process. But as I work with it, I can notice myself caring about this person's basic humanity and basic well-being just much more naturally. And that's really one of the byproducts of forgiveness. So when we forgive someone, it doesn't mean, I don't think we can get caught up in this, I'm going to hit this line of forgiveness, this goal of I have forgiven this person. And in my experience, that's just rarely how it is. I think there is a point where we, maybe tip over the other way, more towards forgiveness than toward resentment. But forgiveness is a continual process. There are also people that a lot of us have in our lives, that maybe they're not causing any immense harm, but they're causing harm repeatedly. We can forgive someone, but then they cause harm again, maybe slightly. Maybe it's a small thing, not big enough that we do cut them out of our lives, but they continue to cause harm. And that can bring up, at that point, it's basically impossible to forgive them completely, because there's always new things arising. But what we can do is meet things with a heart that's inclined towards forgiveness to begin with. And what I mean by that is, as we practice forgiveness, sometimes we've offered forgiveness practices in groups, and people have raised their hands and said, I really like that practice. I really think I could benefit from it when I have a resentment present. But right now, I just don't connect with it because I don't really have any like steaming resentments like I do sometimes. And my response is always the same. That's great. That's wonderful. Continue to work with this intention to forgive anyways, because what happens is then when someone does cause us harm, or we do cause harm to ourselves or someone else, that forgiveness comes more naturally. We're more inclined towards forgiving. I think forgiveness goes hand in hand with the other heart practices. With metta, this wish of well-being, we can't really truly wish for someone's well-being or good, happiness or joy or ease if we have this resentment clouding our judgment. We can't respond with compassion, with seeing the suffering and being with the suffering, either our own or someone else's, if we're too steeped in resentment. Forgiveness really is almost like a precursor to these other heart practices in a way. That when we practice forgiveness and we have a heart that can let go or let be, we can respond with more kindness to others and to ourselves. So just to wrap up, I think that it's really important to note with forgiveness practice that there's a difference between forgiveness as a quality and forgiveness as a practice. Often what happens in forgiveness practice is as we sit and we begin to offer ourselves these phrases or offer them to someone else, the mind responds by, bringing up this resentment again because it's trying to keep us safe. And, there's science to back this up, that the mind and body are kind of hardwired for survival, hardwired for evolution, not hardwired necessarily for our happiness. So when you go to try to say, like, may I forgive myself, or may I forgive, this person, the mind goes, no, that's not safe. Don't do that. And how that often comes up is judgment, is reasons why you shouldn't forgive yourself or someone else, is just kind of some pain or a feeling of unsafety. And I think we have to know for ourselves where that line is of how far can we dive into forgiveness with someone before it is unsafe or unwise. Because there are times that people have had, severe harm caused, what I would call trauma. And working with forgiveness with that right off the bat, we're not going to be able to forgive the person completely all the time, and it might activate a little bit of trauma, a little bit of experience in the nervous system, a little bit of experience in the mind and fear, and that's natural. But what we can do is just recognize how the mind is doing that. We come back to the phrases as many times as the mind wanders, but it is beneficial just to notice what the mind or body or what experience is going on, what the mind and body are doing. When you offer yourself a phrase of forgiveness and then the mind immediately wanders, what happened there? And this isn't to say that we should spend our forgiveness practice figuring everything out, but I do think that the more we tune in with mindfulness, as with any heart practice, to bring this quality of mindfulness to it, we can see what happens. For me, I can work with forgiveness with someone else. And when I offer forgiveness for myself, I notice that the mind and body kind of clench or tighten around the idea. And then the mind gets going of like, oh, but this and but that, almost immediately. And I can watch that and notice it and just come back to the phrases instead of hooking into it. So I mention this because sometimes people do forgiveness practice and they think, I don't feel very forgiving right now. And that's okay. If you were already perfectly forgiving, you probably wouldn't need a forgiveness practice. It's a continual effort, and it's okay to come up against, kind of the opposite of forgiveness or some difficulty during practice. So with that, we'll open it up for questions, and anything goes about forgiveness with yourself or forgiveness with others, or anything that came up for you. Thank you for listening to One Mind Dharma's recorded talks. These are talks recorded from our in-person groups in Sonoma County and our online groups that we teach. You can learn more about our talks at oneminddharma.com/talks.